The cold came suddenly. One moment, Amelia Davis was guiding her horse through the mountain pass, the snow softly crunching underfoot. The next, the world was swallowed by a storm that turned the heavens to white, the wind howling as if it were alive, clawing at her face, her body, her very soul. She could barely see 3 feet in front of her, and with each gust of wind, her vision grew blurrier. Amelia urged her horse forward, but the animal stumbled, its hooves sliding across the icy ground, barely able to find traction. The rein slipped through her fingers, her hands so numb she couldn't feel the leather. The world around her had become nothing but white, a swirling, blinding mass of snow and wind. For 2 days, she had ridden in silence, desperate to escape the life her father had planned for her. An arranged marriage to a man twice her age, a silver mine owner named Harold Peton, had been the price for her family's financial stability. She wasn't blind, she understood that it was business, but it wasn't a life. It was a transaction, one that would strip her of any autonomy she had left. Amelia had fled. She was supposed to head to Oregon, to find refuge with her aunt, but the blizzard had found her before she could reach the safe haven she longed for. She was stranded now, alone and vulnerable, on the edge of a snow-filled abyss. The harsh, unforgiving mountains mocked her attempt at freedom. The horse gave one final, desperate lurch before it collapsed beneath her, sending Amelia tumbling into the snow. She tried to push herself up, but the weight of the storm crushed her spirit. Her body refused to respond as she crawled, her hands scraping against the snow in search of anything to cling to. The snow around her seemed to mock her every effort, as if the mountain itself were trying to swallow her whole. The icy wind bit at her skin, the sting nearly unbearable. She could feel her body shutting down, the cold seeping deeper into her bones, making every movement more difficult than the last. She had no choice but to let the storm take her. Her horse was dead. She had lost her bags in the fall. All that remained was the fine traveling cloak she'd wrapped herself in, now soaked through and frozen solid. She could hear the storm calling to her, beckoning her to close her eyes, to sleep, to let go. But then, through the storm's fury, she saw a shadow moving, large and unyielding, like a creature of legend, its form growing more distinct as it approached. Amelia tried to scream, but her throat was frozen, her breath cut off by the weight of the cold pressing down on her chest. The figure came closer, impossibly large, like a bear walking upright. As it drew nearer, she saw that it was a man, a massive man, towering at least 7 feet, his shoulders so broad they blocked out the swirling storm behind him. His face was hidden behind a dark beard, caked with snow and ice. When he spoke, his voice was a deep rumble, like the cracking of rocks under pressure. "You will die out here." Amelia tried to speak, to protest, but the words wouldn't come. She could only nod weakly, too cold, too broken to say anything more. Her body no longer obeyed her. She couldn't even feel her limbs anymore. But then, without warning, the massive figure bent down and scooped her up as if she weighed no more than a feather. His arms were impossibly strong, and his warmth radiated through her frozen cloak, sending a shock through her body. He didn't speak again, but Amelia could feel the strength in him, the power that coursed through his every movement. His grip was firm, unyielding, and he carried her with an ease that spoke of years of surviving in the wilderness. His chest was warm against hers, and she felt an odd sense of safety that she hadn't felt in days. She had no idea who he was or why he had come for her, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel completely alone. He walked with purpose, moving steadily through the storm, and Amelia's vision grew dim as the exhaustion of the storm, the cold, and the fear overwhelmed her. She tried to speak again, to ask where he was taking her, but the words never made it past her lips. The world around her spun into darkness, and she gave in, knowing she was no longer alone. When Amelia woke, it was to the warmth of a fire crackling nearby, the smell of wood smoke, and something unfamiliar cooking. Perhaps. Her body ached, her muscles sore from the cold and the effort of moving through the snow, but the warmth was a welcome relief. Her eyes fluttered open, and she found herself lying on a soft, fur-lined bed in a small cabin. The walls around her were made of rough-hewn logs, the ceiling low and sturdy. The air smelled of smoke and earth, and the fire in the corner threw dancing shadows across the walls. Amelia blinked, confused, unsure of where she was or how she had gotten there. Then she heard his voice. "You're awake," he said, his tone deep, gravelly. Amelia's gaze turned toward the man who sat across from her. He was massive, tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick brown beard and long, unkempt hair. His features were strong, chiseled, and his pale blue eyes studied her with an intensity that made her heart race. There was no warmth in his gaze, only a quiet, watchful vigilance, as if he was constantly scanning the world for threats. "Where am I?" Amelia managed to croak, her throat still raw from the cold. "My cabin," the man replied simply, his voice carrying a weight that made his words feel like facts. "I found you in the storm. You were alone. Your horse is dead. You would have died out there if I hadn't found you." Amelia tried to sit up, but pain lanced through her body, forcing her back onto the furs. The man moved to her side, his large hand gently pressing against her shoulder. "Don't move yet. You're not ready." She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath. She couldn't understand it. How had she ended up here? Why was she alive? Why had he taken her in? His gaze never left her face, and when she looked into his eyes, she saw something dark and complex. She couldn't place it, but it made her heart beat faster. "I need to leave," she said, her voice coming out as a weak whisper. "I was traveling to Oregon. My aunt, she's waiting for me." The man shook his head slowly, as if he had heard this all before. "The pass is closed. The snow's too deep. You won't make it 5 miles. You'll die out there. The storm's trapped you here." Amelia felt panic rise in her chest. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't be trapped. She had to escape, had to find a way to continue her journey. "How long?" she asked, the words barely escaping her lips. 4 months. Maybe 5, the man answered, his voice flat. "Until the thaw comes. 4 months. Trapped in this cabin with a stranger." She couldn't believe it. She had been running from one prison to another. This was no better than what she had fled back home. But there was no choice. The storm had taken that away from her. And now, the only thing she could do was stay and wait, with this man who had saved her life. As the days passed, Amelia began to realize that she was not simply trapped by the snow. She was trapped by him, Nathaniel Blackwood, the man who had saved her life, but whose presence filled the cabin with something she couldn't quite understand. He was rough, guarded, and completely unbothered by the isolation. His world, it seemed, had always been one of solitude, but Amelia didn't know if she could survive in a world so completely different from her own. The rules were unclear, the tension thick, and yet, each day brought her closer to understanding something deeper, something darker, and more compelling than she could have imagined. The first few days were the hardest. The physical pain of her body recovering from the storm and the fall was unbearable. Amelia's limbs ached as though she had been beaten, her muscles stiff and sore from the cold. But it wasn't just her body that rebelled. There was something unsettling about the silence in the cabin. Nathaniel Blackwood never spoke much, but the few words he did say were blunt and to the point. He seemed entirely unaffected by the solitude, as though the isolation was his natural state. He moved around the cabin with ease, a man who had lived in this small, stark space for years, if not decades. Every motion seemed calculated, purposeful, as if his existence was one of ritual and survival. Amelia, on the other hand, was struggling with the lack of freedom. Trapped by both the snow and the man who had saved her, she found herself feeling both protected and imprisoned. The pass was blocked, the road to Oregon impassable until the spring. She had no choice but to stay here, with this stranger, in this cabin that felt both like a sanctuary and a cage. The fire crackled in the corner of the room, throwing flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Amelia sat by it, wrapped in a thick fur blanket, her gaze lost in the dancing flames. Nathaniel moved about the room, his heavy boots thudding on the wooden floor as he checked the small stores of food he kept in the cabin. He was a large man, his size imposing, even in the cramped space. His movements were silent but deliberate, and Amelia found herself watching him, her eyes drawn to his every motion. "Why do you live here?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Her voice cracked as she spoke, the isolation making her feel almost desperate for conversation. Nathaniel didn't stop what he was doing. He simply gave her a long, measuring look. "Same reason you ran into a blizzard," he said flatly. "Sometimes what's behind us is worse than what's ahead." The words hung in the air like a thick fog. He hadn't elaborated, and Amelia didn't push him further. Instead, she absorbed the weight of his words, wondering what he had left behind to bring him to this isolated cabin. She couldn't imagine the kind of life that could drive a man to choose solitude over the world beyond. Days stretched into weeks, and Amelia's body slowly regained its strength. She spent her time learning the ways of the mountains, how to cook with the limited supplies Nathaniel kept, how to mend the clothes she had worn when she arrived, how to read the weather by the way the wind shifted. Every day, Nathaniel taught her something new, though his lessons were mostly practical survival skills, basic tasks to keep her alive. But in the quiet moments, when the firelight danced across his face, she would catch glimpses of something deeper in his eyes, something untold, like a story he wasn't yet ready to share. The cabin was small, but it was home to Nathaniel in a prophetic way that Amelia couldn't quite understand. He moved through it with the ease of someone who had made it his own, who had lived in it for years, maybe even decades. The rough furniture was arranged for efficiency rather than comfort, and the only personal touches were the bits of wood carvings scattered around wolves, bears, birds of prey, creatures of the wild, that he seemed to hold in some sort of reverence. There was a particular carving on the mantel, a piece of wood shaped into a fierce-looking wolf. Amelia had noticed it from the moment she woke up in the cabin. Nathaniel had never commented on it, but she found herself drawn to it, unable to look away. It was intricately detailed, its fur, eyes, and teeth, almost lifelike in their precision. "Who carved this?" she asked one evening, after a long day spent learning how to prepare a meal from dried meat. Nathaniel glanced at the carving, his expression unreadable. "Me," he said simply. "A long time ago." Amelia studied him for a moment. She couldn't imagine what had driven him to carve something so intricate, so alive. She felt as though she was starting to understand him, piece by piece, but the more she understood, the more questions arose. The storm had passed, but the cold remained. It seemed to seep into every crack of the cabin, and despite the fire, the air still felt biting. Every night, Nathaniel made sure the fire stayed well stocked, the warmth of the flames keeping the cold at bay. But it wasn't just the cold that kept Amelia awake at night. There was something about Nathaniel, something in the way he moved, the way his eyes lingered just a moment too long, the way his presence filled the cabin, that left her restless. He never spoke of his past, and Amelia hadn't asked. She could tell that he wasn't someone who welcomed personal questions, but there were moments when his past seemed to bleed into the present, glimpses of memories in the way he carried himself in the marking eluder, the way he looked out the window sometimes, as if he were seeing something that wasn't there. One evening, after the sun had set and the fire had died down to embers, Amelia found herself sitting by the window, watching the stars flicker through the snow. The storm had left a blanket of ice on everything, turning the world outside into a frozen wonderland. "Tell me something about yourself," she said, her voice breaking the silence. "Something real." Nathaniel looked up from the small pot he had been tending, his eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't answer immediately, as if weighing the request. The tension in the air grew thick, and for a moment Amelia thought he might refuse. "Real?" he asked, his voice low, almost amused. "You want me to tell you my life story?" Amelia didn't flinch. "I want to know who you are," she said softly. "What brought you here?" Nathaniel stared at her for a long time, and in that silence, something shifted. His gaze softened, just a fraction. And for the first time, Amelia saw the pain behind his eyes, the scars of a life lived in isolation, far from the world that had abandoned him. "I used to have a partner," he said after a long pause, his voice rough. "We worked together, trapped in the high country, hunting, trapping. We had a good thing going, until it was taken from me." Amelia didn't move, didn't speak. She felt the weight of his words settle between them, and for the first time, she felt the true isolation he had chosen. He had lost someone, something, and it had driven him here, into the mountains, to a life of solitude. "I killed 7 men that day," he continued, his voice quieter now, the words heavy with the weight of what had happened. "Took them down one by one, made them pay for what they did." Amelia could only listen, her heart heavy with the understanding that Nathaniel's life was not just a story of survival. It was a story of loss, of violence, and of a need to escape the ghosts of the past. She didn't know how to respond to that. She didn't know if she could, but she wanted him to understand. "You had to do what you had to do," she said softly. "Surviving in a world like this, sometimes it's the only choice." Nathaniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up and walked to the window, his silhouette framed against the darkness outside. "Sometimes," he said, his voice low and distant, "I don't know if I'm running from them or running from myself." Amelia didn't know what to say to that, but she understood. There were things in the world that couldn't be outrun, no matter how far you went, no matter how hard you tried. Sometimes the only way forward was to confront them, and in that moment, Amelia realized that she had been running too. She had been running from a life she didn't want, from a future that had been decided for her. But now, here in the cabin with Nathaniel, with the storm outside and the silence between them, she wasn't sure anymore if running was the answer. The tension between them was thick, but something else, something unexpected, had begun to grow, a bond forged in the cold of the mountain, in the shared silence, and in the slow, careful trust that had begun to build between them. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the wind howled outside. The storm had passed, but Amelia knew the worst was yet to come. There would be days like this, silent, heavy with words unsaid. She would have to learn to survive in this new world, this world of snow, isolation, and Nathaniel Blackwood. But for the first time since she arrived in the mountains, Amelia felt something stir inside her, something more than fear, more than doubt, something that felt like hope. The cabin was small, but it was home now, and for the first time in a long while, Amelia wondered if she had finally found a place where she truly belonged. The days drifted by like the slow melting of ice in the early spring. The storm that had brought Amelia into Nathaniel's life was nothing more than a distant memory now. The snow, which had once blanketed the land in an unforgiving icy grip, had begun to soften at the edges, slowly giving way to the faintest hints of warmer weather. The mountain was awakening, but in the cabin the cold still lingered. Amelia had become accustomed to the rhythm of life with Nathaniel, his presence both a comfort and a constant reminder of the strangeness of her situation. Every morning, she woke to the crackling of the fire and the scent of coffee brewing, which Nathaniel had taught her to make over the fire. He was always up before her, always working, always moving. But lately, something had changed. The fire in the hearth had begun to warm the room, and Nathaniel's mood seemed lighter, though only slightly. There were fewer moments of silence between them, and more moments when he would speak without the usual guardedness. Amelia sat by the fire one morning, her hands wrapped around the warmth of her own cup, watching the flames dance. The sun was low, still hidden behind the mountain ridges, casting long shadows into the cabin. Nathaniel was at the table, hunched over a piece of wood, carving something intricate with his knife. "You've been carving a lot," Amelia remarked, her voice quiet. She had noticed it over the past few days, the small carvings he'd made, scattered throughout the cabin. "What are you making?" Nathaniel didn't look up, his eyes focused on the wood. "A new piece," he said simply, his deep voice muffled by the concentration he was putting into the work. Amelia watched him for a moment, her curiosity piqued. "Can I see it?" Without responding, Nathaniel slid the piece across the table to her. It was another wolf, a little smaller than the previous ones, but with more detail. The eyes were sharp, the fur meticulously carved, and the snarl on. Its lips was almost lifelike. She ran her fingers over the carved figure, noting the care he had put into it. The wolf's gaze was fierce, and yet there was something vulnerable about it, something she couldn't quite place. "Why wolves?" she asked, looking up at him. He seemed to hesitate for a moment, his hands stilling over the wood before he responded. "Wolves know what it is to survive alone. They protect what they have, and they don't give up easily." There was something in his tone that made her pause, something in the way he said it, like it was more than just a statement about the carving. It was as though he was telling her more than he was ready to reveal. Amelia studied him for a long moment, trying to decipher the layers beneath his words. But Nathaniel was not an easy man to read. His eyes, pale and watchful, held everything in and nothing at all. As the days grew longer, Nathaniel's careful detachment began to erode. There was no particular reason for it, no defining moment where he shifted from the silent, solitary figure who had carried her through the storm to the man who now spent hours teaching her how to identify plants, how to track animals, how to start fires without the flint. He had shared things with her about the wild, about the land he had come to know so intimately. She had come to rely on him, even though, at times, it felt like she was losing herself in his world. The boundaries between them had blurred over time. They shared meals, shared space, and sometimes when the fire was particularly warm and the night particularly long, there would be moments of silence that felt more like conversation than words could ever convey. Their proximity was inevitable, and with it came something unexpected, an understanding. One evening, as the last of the snow began to recede from the windowsills, Nathaniel came in from the woods with a basket full of herbs and mushrooms. The sun had set, and the last light of the day barely filtered through the cracks in the log walls. Amelia had already started preparing dinner, and as he entered, she looked up, her heart skipping a beat at the sight of him. His ruggedness had become a constant in her life. The way he moved, the way he spoke, the quiet intensity with which he approached everything he did. "Did you find everything?" she asked, brushing her hair behind her ear. Nathaniel dropped the basket onto the table, his face hardening for a moment. "I found enough," he replied, his voice gruff. He stood there for a long moment, just staring at her, his blue eyes flicking over her face. Amelia felt a sudden flutter in her chest, her pulse quickening at the weight of his gaze. "You've been looking at me differently," he said, his voice softer than usual. There was a question in his eyes, a weight she hadn't expected. Amelia felt the breath leave her body. Was it that obvious? Could he sense the shift in her own feelings? The quiet, growing attraction she had been trying to ignore? She couldn't lie to herself anymore. There were things about him, about Nathaniel, that called to her in ways she had never known before. His strength, his solitude, the way he had protected her from the storm, from the danger, from herself. She turned away from him, her hands shaking slightly as she prepared the mushrooms. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice a little too high-pitched. She was caught off guard. The tension between them was thick, palpable. Nathaniel's gaze never left her, and he walked over to the table. He stood behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, his presence filling the space around her. "I've seen the way you look at me," he said, his voice low, steady. "Like you're trying to figure something out." Amelia's heart hammered in her chest, but she refused to turn around. She was caught in the web of her own emotions, unsure of how to untangle herself. "I don't know what you mean," she repeated, but it sounded less convincing now. Her voice was a breathy whisper, filled with unspoken longing. Nathaniel's fingers brushed against her shoulder, just a slight touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. "Amelia." He said her name like a warning, like it was a promise and a plea all at once. His hands settled on her shoulders, and she finally turned to face him, her heart racing in her chest. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled behind them, but in that moment, the warmth from the flames seemed to pale in comparison to the heat between them. Nathaniel's eyes searched her face, and she felt something shift, something that had been building ever since the night he had carried her through the storm. "I don't want to leave here," she said, the words slipping from her mouth before she could stop them. The truth was finally out. She had been running from so much her father's expectations, the life he had planned for her. But now, trapped in the mountains with Nathaniel, she realized that she didn't want to escape anymore. Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly, and his grip on her shoulders tightened as well. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not while I'm here. Not until you understand what this is." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know if he meant his words as a promise or as a command, but something inside her shifted. There was a vulnerability in his words that struck her deep. She had never known a man like him. A man who spoke in truths and had no patience for lies. A man who had lived through his own pain and who now stood before her, offering something she wasn't sure she could accept. Nathaniel leaned closer, and before she could protest, his lips were on hers. The kiss was not gentle, it was fierce, urgent. The kind of kiss that spoke of need and longing, of a desire so raw that it could no longer be contained. Amelia's body responded before her mind could catch up, her arms wrapping around his neck as she pulled him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nathaniel rested his forehead against hers. "You're mine now," he whispered, the words low and rough. For a moment, Amelia felt the weight of his words, the finality in them. But then she realized something. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. There was a part of her that had always felt incomplete, always felt like she was running. But with Nathaniel, she felt found. She nodded slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm yours," she said, her voice steady. Nathaniel pulled back just enough to look at her, his pale blue eyes filled with something fierce and tender all at once. "And when spring comes, we'll build a future together, you and me. But until then..." His words trailed off as he kissed her again, and this time, it wasn't just about survival. It wasn't Mannix's, about being trapped in a cabin. It was about the beginning of something new, something real.